Imagine the world through the eyes of a ghost. You aren't just watching a screen, you're slipping through a back door on Lambkin Lane in 1963. The air is thick with the scent of floor wax and the cloying perfume of a sister who thinks she's alone. You see the kitchen knife, not as a tool, but as an extension of your own silent void. You aren't a person, you are a presence, climbing the stairs toward a secret that can only be kept in blood. This isn't a crime, it's a homecoming. The world outside was a monochrome painting of suburban peace, yet inside, the shadows stretched like long hungry fingers across the linoleum. We begin not with a person, but with a presence. This is a gaze that doesn't just watch, it consumes. The camera, our eyes, moves with a predatory grace, slipping through the back door as if the house itself were exhaling a welcome. The kitchen was bathed in the pale, sickly glow of a moonlight that felt far too bright for comfort. There, resting on the counter, was the first instrument of betrayal, a heavy, silver-plated kitchen knife. The metal was cold, a stark contrast to the simmering heat radiating from the floor above. As a small, trembling hand reached for the hilt, the silence of the house was punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock, a heartbeat for a home that was about to stop breathing. A sanctuary of secrets. As the silent observer began the slow, agonizing ascent up the stairs, the sounds of the night changed. The wind outside died down, replaced by the muffled, rhythmic thrum of music from a bedroom, and something else. A whisper. A sigh. Judith Myers was the crown jewel of Haddonfield's youth, a girl who moved with a confidence that bordered on the scandalous. To the town, she was a daughter. To the darkness in the hallway, she was a focal point of a confusing, burning resentment. The door to her room was slightly ajar, casting a sliver of warm, amber light into the hallway. The air here was different. It was heavy with the scent of cloying perfume and spent adrenaline. Through the crack in the door, the ambiguity of the scene was intoxicating. Shadows danced against the floral wallpaper, the silhouette of a young man hurrying to dress, the rustle of sheets that had been tossed aside in a moment of frantic youthful abandon. "He's gone, Judith," a voice might have whispered in the mind of the watcher. But the scent of him remains. Judith sat at her vanity, her hair a wild halo, her silk robe slipping just enough to hint at the clandestine heat of the evening she'd just shared. She was humming a tune that sounded like an invitation to a secret she would never actually tell. There was a lingering glow on her skin, that flush of someone who had just tasted a forbidden fruit and found it sweet. She was beautiful, she was alive, and in that soap opera haze of post-romantic bliss, she was entirely vulnerable. The cold awakening. The transition was instantaneous. The warmth of the room was punctured by the sudden entrance of the clown. The mask, a cheap plastic grin with hollow eyes, was a grotesque parody of the joy Halloween was supposed to bring. Judith didn't scream at first. Perhaps she thought it was a prank, a final playful coda to her night of rebellion. But the silver of the knife caught the amber light, and the tempting atmosphere of the bedroom curdled into a clinical rhythmic terror. The first strike, a rupture in the silk. The second strike, a silencing of the hum. The finality, the way the blood looked like spilled wine against the white sheets. There was no struggle, only a graceful, horrific descent into the stillness. The shape didn't linger to admire the work, it simply turned and retreated, moving back down into the cool, indifferent night. The reveal of the void. Outside, the neighborhood was still. A car pulled into the driveway, the parents, returning from a night of their own. They found a child standing on the lawn, the mask hanging limp in his hand, his face as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't a crime of passion. As the camera pulled back, revealing the small 6-year-old Michael Myers, the audience realized the true horror. The sexual heat of Judith's room had been extinguished by a coldness that had no name. The boy didn't look like a killer. He looked like an empty vessel, waiting for the next 15 years to fill him with a purpose that Haddonfield would never survive. The transition from the blood-warm air of a Haddonfield bedroom to the sterile, frost-bitten corridors of Smith's Grove Sanitarium was more than a change of scenery. It was a descent into a purgatory of the soul. If Chapter 1 was a fever dream of youthful transgression and sudden silence, Chapter 2 is the long, cold hangover, a 15-year vigil where the walls themselves seemed to sweat with the weight of what they contained. The Gothic solitude of Smith's Grove. Smith's Grove was not a place of healing, it was a warehouse for the forgotten. The architecture was a soap opera caricature of institutional dread, high, arched ceilings that swallowed sound and long, dimly lit hallways where the scent of industrial floor wax fought a losing battle against the damp smell of old stone. In the center of this labyrinth sat Dr. Samuel Loomis. In 1964, Loomis was a man of science, a man who still believed that every lock had a key and every darkness had a source. He entered Michael's room with a notepad and a flickering sense of hope. He expected a broken child, perhaps a victim of some hidden trauma that had finally snapped the tether of his sanity. Instead, he found a statue. Michael sat by the window, bathed in the gray flat light of a central Illinois afternoon. He was 7 now, but his posture held the stillness of an ancient predator. He didn't look at the birds outside or the nurses who brought him lukewarm trays of food. He looked at the air. He looked through the world as if it were a thin, annoying veil he was waiting to tear. The temptation of the void. As the years bled into one another, the relationship between Loomis and Michael took on a provocative, almost obsessive intimacy. Loomis became the jilted lover of Michael's psyche, constantly reaching out for a response, a flicker of humanity, a sign of remorse, anything to prove that his life's work wasn't being poured into a bottomless pit. There were nights when the sanitarium felt strangely charged. The staff whispered about the boy in room 31. Some of the younger nurses found themselves drawn to his door, peering through the small reinforced glass window with a mixture of dread and a shameful, forbidden curiosity. Michael was growing. He was becoming a man of imposing physical presence, a silent titan of muscle and repressed energy. There was an ambiguity to his stillness, a primal raw magnetism that suggested a well of power kept under a glass-tight seal. One nurse, a woman named Sharon who had seen too much of the world's ugliness, once confessed to Loomis that standing near Michael felt like standing near a furnace that was turned off, yet still radiated a ghostly, skin-prickling heat. It wasn't sexual in the traditional sense, but it was carnal, a physical awareness of a body that had never known the touch of another, a vessel of pure evil that remained unsoiled by the complexities of human emotion. "He doesn't breathe like us, Sam," she whispered in the break room, her hands trembling around a cigarette. "He breathes like he's counting the seconds until the world ends." The breaking point, October 30th, 1978. By the time the calendar turned to 1978, Loomis had stopped trying to cure Michael. He had spent 15 years staring into those eyes, those blackest eyes, the devil's eyes, and he had realized that the boy he met in 1963 was gone long before the knife ever touched Judith. The atmosphere on the night of the transfer was thick with a sweaty electric tension. A storm was brewing, the kind that made the skin itch and the nerves fray. The plan was simple: move Michael to a hearing to determine his future. But Loomis knew the truth. This wasn't a legal proceeding, it was an invitation. As the station wagon pulled up to the gates of Smith's Grove, the rain began to fall in heavy rhythmic sheets. The sanitarium was in chaos. Patients, the lost souls of the ward, were wandering the grounds in their thin white gowns, soaked to the bone, laughing and crying into the wind. It was a scene of unbridled, messy humanity, a stark contrast to the calculated, cold elegance of Michael's escape. He didn't run. He moved with the grace of a shadow reclaiming its place. When he stepped toward the car, the struggle with the nurse was brief, almost balletic in its efficiency. There was a moment, a brief, ambiguous pause, where Michael's hand brushed against the glass, a ghostly echo of the touch he had denied the world for over a decade. Then he was gone. The road back to the beginning. Loomis stood in the mud, the rain washing away the last of his professional composure. He watched the taillights of the stolen wagon disappear into the treeline. He didn't need a map to know where Michael was going. The shape was returning to the source of its first heat, the place where the silk robe had slipped and the blood had run cold. Michael was going home to Haddonfield, not as a man seeking revenge, but as a force seeking its shadow. The 15-year wait was over. The void was no longer contained by stone and steel. It was out on the open road, breathing, waiting, and hungry for the night to begin. The soap opera of Michael's incarceration had reached its season finale. Now the real horror, the reunion, was about to begin. The transition from the clinical gray of Smith's Grove to the vibrant, amber-hued streets of Haddonfield was like waking from a coma into a technicolor dream. It was the morning of October 31st, 1978, and the town was draped in the sumptuous transient beauty of autumn. Leaves of burnt orange and deep crimson skittered across the pavement, whispering secrets to the wind. But beneath this postcard-perfect surface, a cold current was beginning to flow, a silent rhythmic pulse that signaled the return of a ghost. The return of the prodigal son. Michael didn't enter Haddonfield with a roar. He arrived with a haunting, balletic grace. The stolen station wagon moved through the town like a shark in shallow water. He didn't head for the police station or the crowded center of town. He headed for the source. The Myers house stood as a rotted tooth in a mouth of healthy smiles. Its wood was grayed by 15 years of neglect, its windows like cataract-clouded eyes. Michael stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under a weight they hadn't felt since a 6-year-old boy stood in a clown mask. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of dust and the faint ghostly metallic tang of a night long ago. He didn't just stand there, he reclaimed the space. He retrieved the knife, not just a tool, but an extension of his own void. Then came the mask. From a local hardware store, he had taken a plain, white, expressionless face. When he pulled it on, the man named Michael Myers vanished. What remained was the shape, an ambiguous, terrifying entity that offered no reflection of humanity, only a blank slate for the town's deepest fears. The subject of the gaze, Laurie Strode. Enter Laurie Strode. If Haddonfield was a soap opera, Laurie was the ingenue who didn't know she was the lead. She walked down the street with her books clutched to her chest, a shield against a world she felt slightly out of step with. She was the good girl, the one who studied while her friends, Annie and Linda, chased the fleeting, sweaty thrills of high school romance. But Laurie had something the others lacked, a primal, skin-crawling intuition. As she walked past the old Myers place, she felt it. A gaze. It wasn't the clumsy, leering look of a high school boy, it was something profoundly intimate and predatory. It was a heat that didn't warm, a stare that seemed to peel back the layers of her sensible wool sweater and peek at the racing heart beneath. She turned. There, behind a hedge, stood a figure. A man in a pale mask, as still as a tombstone. The ambiguity of his presence was agonizing. He didn't move toward her. He didn't threaten. He simply existed in her peripheral vision, a silent promise of a climax that was still hours away. The slow, provocative dance. Throughout the afternoon, the shape began a flirtation with Laurie's sanity. It was a game of shadows and glimpses, a teasing, slow-burn psychological seduction. The classroom window. As Laurie listened to a lecture on the nature of fate, she looked out the window. There, across the street, the station wagon sat idling. The shape sat behind the wheel, staring up at her. The glass between them felt paper-thin. The laundry line. Later at home, she saw him standing amidst the billowing white sheets of a neighbor's laundry. The fabric danced in the wind, obscuring and then revealing the white mask. It was a visual striptease of terror, and now you see me, now you don't, that left Laurie breathless and trembling. The backyard, a sudden shadow against the fence, a rustle in the bushes that disappeared the moment she called out. The tension in Haddonfield was no longer just about Halloween, it was becoming carnal and heavy. Laurie's friends laughed off her concerns. Annie, with her sharp tongue and tighter clothes, mocked Laurie's secret admirer. Maybe he wants to take you to the dance, Laurie, Annie teased, her voice dripping with a provocative irony. Maybe he's just shy. But Laurie knew better. The way the shape watched her wasn't shy. It was possessive. It was the look of someone who had waited 15 years to finish a conversation that started with a knife. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawns, the soap opera of Haddonfield's youth was about to collide with the horror of Michael's return. The setting of the sun. The golden hour arrived, bathing the town in a deceptive, honey-colored light. The trick-or-treaters began to emerge, their small, costumed bodies a colorful distraction from the tall, white-masked figure now standing in the center of the sidewalk, unnoticed by everyone but the girl in the upstairs window. Laurie watched from her bedroom, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass. The shape didn't move. He was waiting for the darkness. He was waiting for the moment when the masks of the townspeople came off and his mask, the only one that mattered, became the true face of Haddonfield. The stage was set. The characters were in place. The tempting dread of the afternoon was about to harden into the cold, clinical reality of the night. The boogeyman wasn't coming. He was already here, breathing in the shadows of the hedges, waiting for the first scream to break the silence. The sun finally surrendered, slipping behind the horizon and leaving Haddonfield in a bruised, purple twilight. This was the hour when the town's wholesome facade began to fray at the edges, replaced by the pulsing neon and shadow energy of Halloween night. In the soap opera of these suburban lives, the night was supposed to be a stage for secret meetings, stolen kisses, and the thrill of the forbidden. But as the street lamps hummed to life, casting pools of sickly yellow light onto the asphalt, a different kind of desire began to circulate through the neighborhood, a cold, mechanical hunger. The arrival of the night. Halloween night in Haddonfield was a sensory overload. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the sugary rot of fallen apples. Children in plastic masks darted through the streets, their laughter echoing with a shrill, manic edge. But while the town celebrated the scary, the true terror moved with a hushed, elegant silence. The shape had transitioned from an observer to an infiltrator. He no longer stood behind hedges, he was now a part of the architecture of the night. He moved through the backyards, his boots crunching rhythmically on the dry leaves, a sound that mimicked a steady, unhurried heartbeat. He wasn't in a rush. He knew that the night was long, and the fruit he intended to pluck was ripening in the warm, lit houses scattered along the block. The babysitting game. Laurie Strode arrived at the Doyle house, her sensible cardigan pulled tight. Inside, the atmosphere was a sanctuary of domesticity, the glow of the television, the scent of popcorn, and the wide-eyed wonder of young Tommy Doyle. But across the street at the Wallace house, the mood was entirely different. Annie Brackett and Linda van der Klok were treating their babysitting duties like a provocative rehearsal for adulthood. The Wallace house was a stage of soft lighting and whispered phone calls. Annie, bored and restless, moved through the kitchen with a languid feline energy. She was waiting for her boyfriend, Paul, her mind filled with the simmering youthful heat of a night away from her father's watchful eyes. The ambiguity of the atmosphere was thick. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to hold a breath, every creak of the floorboards felt like a secret being told. When Annie went to the laundry room to dry her clothes, stripping down to an oversized shirt, the camera lingered on the vulnerability of the moment. She was a picture of unconscious invitation, her skin glowing under the harsh fluorescent light of the basement, unaware that just inches away, on the other side of the glass, a white mask was watching her with a void-like intensity. The first movement, Annie. Michael's first move was a masterpiece of clinical patience. He didn't burst through the door, he waited for Annie to come to him. As she walked to her car, intending to pick up Paul, the shape emerged from the back seat like a ghost materializing from the upholstery. The struggle was brief, almost intimate in its proximity. There was a horrific, stark beauty to the way the silver of the knife caught the light of the moon before it descended. There was no scream that reached the neighbors, only the sound of a horn being leaned on, a long, mournful note that signaled the end of Annie's rebellious youth. He left her there, a broken doll in the front seat, and turned his gaze back toward the house. The ritual of Linda and Bob. Next came Linda and her boyfriend, Bob. They entered the Wallace house with the loud, brash confidence of teenagers who believed they were invincible. They were looking for a place to be alone, their laughter dripping with a clandestine, hormone-fueled excitement. As they moved to the upstairs bedroom, the shape followed. He watched from the doorway, a silent witness to their fumbling, urgent intimacy. To Bob and Linda, the world ended at the edge of the mattress. To Michael, they were merely components in a ritual he was about to conclude. When Bob went downstairs to get a beer, the shape met him in the kitchen. The kill was a display of superhuman, terrifying strength. Michael pinned Bob to the wall with the knife, lifting him off the floor as if he weighed nothing. He didn't look away, he tilted his head, studying Bob's dying twitches with a curiosity that was more scientific than sadistic. It was the look of an artist assessing a canvas before the final stroke. The final tableau. The chapter concludes with the most iconic, provocative image of the night. Linda, waiting in the bedroom, heard a knock at the door. She expected Bob. Instead, a figure entered draped in a white bedsheet, wearing Bob's glasses over the fabric, a ghost costume that was both absurd and bone-chilling. Linda giggled, her voice a mix of playful teasing and lingering heat. "Bob? You're such a nut," she whispered, reaching out for the ghost. The ambiguity of the moment was suffocating. The figure moved closer, the sheet rustling. Linda reached out to touch the fabric, her fingers searching for the skin beneath. But instead of a warm embrace, she found the cold, unyielding grip of the shape's hands. As he strangled her with the telephone cord, the phone itself off the hook, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic beep 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 of a disconnected line, a digital pulse for a life that was slipping away in the dark. Michael didn't just kill them, he staged them. He began to move the bodies, preparing a house of horrors for the one person left on his list. The sun was long gone, the soap opera had turned into a requiem, and the shape was finally ready for Laurie Strode to come over and play. The silence in the Doyle house had become a physical weight, a thick, suffocating blanket that even the flickering glow of the television couldn't pierce. For Laurie Strode, the evening had shifted from a mundane chore into a slow-motion descent into isolation. The phone sat on the cradle like a dead weight, a silent witness to the growing void across the street. In the world of Haddonfield's youth, a missed call wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it was a crack in the foundation of their carefully constructed reality. The threshold of dread. Laurie's decision to cross the street was the turning point where the soap opera of teenage life curdled into a gothic nightmare. The walk from the Doyle house to the Wallace house was only a few dozen yards, but in the darkness of Halloween night, it felt like traversing an ocean. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint, cloying scent of late-blooming flowers and something sharper, the metallic tang of cold steel. As she stepped onto the porch of the Wallace house, the atmosphere changed. The house wasn't just dark, it was expectant. The door yielded to her touch with a soft, yielding sigh, as if the building itself were inviting her into its secrets. Inside, the air was heavy and unnervingly warm, holding on to the lingering heat of the evening's earlier, more carnal activities. The Gallery of the Lost. Laurie moved through the downstairs with a tentative, graceful caution. "Annie," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the gloom. There was no answer, only the rhythmic ticking of a clock and the distant, muffled sound of the wind. She climbed the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The upstairs hallway was a corridor of shadows, but the door to the master bedroom stood open, casting a sliver of pale moonlight onto the carpet. As she entered, the ambiguity of the scene was intoxicating and horrific. The room still carried the scent of Linda's perfume, a heavy, floral musk that mingled with the ghost of a sweat-drenched encounter. The bed was a wreckage of silk and tangled sheets, a visual diary of the passion that had unfolded there just an hour before. But the shape had added his own final ritualistic touch. There, propped up against the headboard in a grotesque parody of rest, was Annie. She looked almost peaceful in the dim light, her skin pale and luminous, her eyes fixed on some distant, invisible horizon. And above her, stolen from the cemetery, sat the headstone of Judith Myers. It was a monument to a shared history, a cold stone weight placed atop the sanctuary of youthful desire. The scene was a masterpiece of perversion. Michael hadn't just killed them, he had curated their intimacy into a permanent frozen tableau. The touch of the shape. The realization hit Laurie like a physical blow. The tempting mystery of the night was gone, replaced by a raw, clinical terror. She turned to flee, but the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to detach themselves from the wall. The shape didn't leap, he materialized. The first contact was not a blow, but a brush of cold, calloused fingers against her shoulder, an accidental intimacy that made her skin crawl. Michael moved with a terrifying, liquid efficiency. As he stepped into the moonlight, the white mask looked like a skull carved from ivory, devoid of rage, devoid of pleasure, devoid of anything human. He struck. The knife hissed through the air, a silver flash that carved a line of fire across Laurie's arm. The pain was secondary to the shock, the realization that the boogeyman wasn't a story told to frighten children. He was a physical presence, a mass of muscle and silent, focused intent. The instinct to survive. The struggle that followed was a desperate, uncoordinated dance. Laurie didn't fight like a hero, she fought like a cornered animal. She scrambled backward, her hands searching for anything to use as a weapon. She found a knitting needle, a mundane tool of domesticity that became a spike of salvation. She plunged it into the shape's neck. There was no cry of pain, only a heavy rattling breath as he tumbled backward into the shadows. For a moment, the room returned to its eerie, perfumed silence. Laurie collapsed against the doorframe, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes fixed on the spot where the monster had fallen. She thought it was over. In any other story, the villain stays down. But as she watched, the shape began to rise, not with effort, but with a slow, mechanical inevitability. He didn't look at the wound, he didn't acknowledge the pain. He simply turned his blank white gaze back toward her, the mask caught in a sliver of light that made it look almost like it was smiling. The soap opera of her life had been stripped away, leaving only the primal struggle between the girl who wanted to live and the void that wanted to consume her. The night was only half over, and the shape was just getting started. The night had reached its most fevered pitch. While the residents of Haddonfield slept in their climate-controlled boxes, the streets had become a theater of the macabre. Dr. Samuel Loomis moved through the shadows like a man possessed, his trench coat billowing behind him like the wings of a vengeful crow. For Loomis, this wasn't just a manhunt, it was a climax 15 years in the making. His relationship with Michael had always been a twisted sort of marriage, one bound by silence, observation, and a shared dark understanding of the void. The hunter and the haunted. Loomis patrolled the neighborhood with a desperate, sweating urgency. He had seen the stolen car, he knew the beast was lapping at the shores of this suburban island. Every rustle of a hedge, Every flickering porch light felt like a tease from the universe. In the soap opera of his life, Michael was the ultimate antagonist, the one who never spoke, yet said everything through the carnage he left behind. "He's here," Loomis whispered to the cold October wind, his fingers trembling as they gripped the cold steel of his revolver. The weapon felt heavy, a physical weight that anchored him to a reality that was rapidly dissolving into a nightmare. The descent into the Doyle house. Across the street, Laurie Strode had made it back to the Doyle house. She was a wreck of torn wool and jagged breaths. The tempting safety of the home had been violated. She burst through the front door, her hands fumbling with the locks, her mind a kaleidoscope of the horrors she had seen at the Wallace house. The children, Tommy and Lindsay, were huddled on the sofa, their wide eyes reflecting the blue flickering light of the television. Laurie didn't have time to explain. She was no longer the babysitter, she was the sentinel. She ushered them upstairs, her movements frantic and primal. But the shape was already there. Michael didn't need an invitation. He moved through the house with a predatory, silent fluidity. He was the shadow in the hallway, the cold draft under the door, the silent observer of her rising panic. The atmosphere in the house was thick, almost liquid. The air felt charged with an electric, carnal tension, the kind of heat that precedes a lightning strike. As Laurie hid the children, she found herself cornered in the master bedroom. The closet, a narrow wood-paneled coffin, became her only sanctuary. The closet, an intimacy of terror. Inside the closet, the world narrowed down to the sound of her own heartbeat and the thin slats of the door. The darkness was absolute, save for the slivers of light that cut across her face. And then she heard it. The breathing. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical presence. The rhythmic, heavy inhalation of the shape on the other side of the wood was suffocatingly close. It was an intimate, terrifying vibration that seemed to resonate through the very bones of the house. The ambiguity of the moment was agonizing. It was the closest she had ever been to another person in such a raw, unfiltered state, yet the person on the other side wasn't a man. He was a vacuum. The wood of the door groaned as Michael leaned against it. He didn't rush. He savored the proximity. He thrust the knife through the slats, the silver blade grazing the air inches from Laurie's throat. It was a violent, rhythmic intrusion into her private space, a perverted mimicry of the touch she had seen her friends share earlier that night. Laurie fought back with the only thing she had, a wire coat hanger. She straightened it into a crude spike and thrust it through the slats, feeling it bite into something solid. A muffled grunt. The pressure on the door vanished. The 6 shots of redemption. Laurie stumbled out of the closet, falling onto the floor. Michael was there, rising like a tide. He reached for her, his hands closing around her throat with a grip that was both possessive and final. But the door burst open. Loomis stood in the frame, a silhouette of righteous fury. He didn't hesitate. He didn't call out for Michael to surrender. In the grand finale of this chapter, the doctor spoke with the only language Michael understood, lead. The first shot hit Michael in the chest, the impact snapping his head back. The second and third followed in rapid succession, driving him toward the balcony. The fourth and fifth tore through the white mask, the shape stumbling backward, his movements jerky and unnatural. The 6th shot was the punctuation mark. Michael hit the railing and flipped over, falling 2 stories down to the manicured lawn below. The sound of the impact was a dull thud, the sound of a weight hitting the earth. Loomis rushed to the balcony, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with a mixture of triumph and horror. He looked down. Laurie was behind him, sobbing, her body shaking with the spent adrenaline of a survivor. Was it the boogeyman? She gasped, her voice a broken whisper. Loomis looked at her, his face a mask of grim realization. As a matter of fact, it was. He looked back down at the lawn. The grass was empty. The shape was gone, leaving only an indentation in the earth where a body should have been. The soap opera had ended in blood, but the horror was just beginning to breathe again in the dark. The ringing in Loomis's ears was a high, thin needle of sound, a sharp contrast to the sudden heavy silence that had fallen over the Doyle house. For a few seconds, the air was perfectly still, the kind of stillness that exists in the eye of a hurricane. Loomis leaned over the balcony, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. His eyes searched the shadows of the lawn below, expecting to see a broken, bloodied heap of a man. Instead, he saw the grass. The moonlight illuminated a shallow, dark indentation in the turf, a silhouette of where the shape had landed. But the shape itself was gone. There was no trail of blood, no sound of a retreating footfall, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the earth had simply refused to hold him, or perhaps, as if he had never been physical to begin with. The void had simply reclaimed its own. The marriage of trauma. Inside the room, Laurie Strode lay on the floor, her breath hitching in a rhythmic, jagged sob. The physical heat of the struggle, the sweaty, frantic closeness of Michael's hands around her throat, was cooling into a numbing, bone-deep ice. In the soap opera of her life, this was the moment where the credits should have rolled, where the hero would have stepped forward to offer a comforting embrace. But Loomis didn't move toward her. He remained at the window, a sentinel staring into the abyss. The relationship between the survivor and the stalker had reached its final provocative stage. Laurie wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a witness. She had felt the weight of him, smelled the cold, sterile scent of the mask, and heard the intimate, rhythmic pulse of his breathing against her own skin. It was an unholy union, a bond forged in the dark that could never be truly severed. Even as she sat there, she could still feel the phantom pressure of his grip, a tempting reminder that the boogeyman didn't just want her life, he wanted her soul to recognize his. A tour of the ruins. The camera of the mind begins to pull away from the Doyle house, embarking on a slow voyeuristic tour of the wreckage Michael left behind. We return to the Wallace house across the street. The lights are still on, casting a warm domestic glow that feels like a cruel joke. Inside, the cloying floral scent of Linda's perfume still hangs in the air of the master bedroom, now mingled with the cold metallic smell of the headstone. The bed, once a site of youthful fumbling heat, is now a cold altar. The silence here is heavy, a soap opera set where the actors have all been silenced mid-sentence. The ambiguity of the night's earlier desires has been replaced by the absolute certainty of the grave. The camera moves down the stairs, past the kitchen where Bob was pinned to the door like a butterfly in a display case, and out into the backyard. The wind rustles the laundry that still hangs on the line, the white sheets dancing like ghosts in the moonlight. Each flap of the fabric sounds like a heartbeat, or perhaps, like the rustle of a silk robe falling to the floor. The omnipresence of the shape. Finally, the gaze of the night returns to the Myers house on Lambkin Lane. It sits in total darkness, its windows reflecting nothing. But as we move through the empty rooms, the kitchen where the knife was first taken, the stairs where a 6-year-old boy once climbed toward his destiny, the audio landscape changes. The sound of the wind is joined by something else. The breathing. It is the signature of the shape, a slow, steady mechanical inhalation that fills the empty spaces. It overlays the shot of the Doyle house staircase. It follows the camera into the backyard. It settles into the corners of the Myers house. It is a sound that suggests a carnal, eternal presence. Michael isn't hiding, he is everywhere. He is the shadow behind the door, the chill in the air, the uninvited guest in every Haddonfield home. The ambiguity of the ending is the ultimate cliffhanger. In the soap opera of Haddonfield, there will be no trial, no closure, no final resting place. The town has been marked by the shape's return. The residents will lock their doors and pull their blankets tight, but they will never again feel truly alone. They will always be waiting for the next season, for the moment when the breathing stops being a memory and becomes a presence in the room once more. The film doesn't end with a scream. It ends with the realization that the boogeyman is a cycle, a rhythmic return to the void. As the screen fades to black, the only thing that remains is that heavy rhythmic breath, a promise that the night is never truly over, and the shape is always just one shadow away. The sun rose on November 1st, 1978, not with a triumphant glare, but with a pale, sickly light that struggled to pierce the heavy Haddonfield mist. The town woke up to a reality that was fundamentally altered. The soap opera of suburban safety had been cancelled, replaced by a permanent haunting noir. This final chapter is not about the resolution of a hunt, but about the sediment of fear that Michael Myers left behind, a residue that feels like a cold touch on the back of the neck. The morning after, a study in silence. The Doyle house was no longer a home, it was a crime scene, a skeleton of wood and glass surrounded by the flashing rhythmic pulses of blue and red police lights. The sirens had finally stopped their wailing, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt provocative, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Laurie Strode sat in the back of an ambulance, draped in a heavy wool blanket that couldn't stop the shivering. Her eyes were fixed on the second-story balcony. She wasn't looking for Michael, she was looking at the space where he had been. There was a strange, ambiguous intimacy in her expression, a look of someone who had survived a tragedy but found herself inextricably linked to the perpetrator. She had looked behind the mask, and even though she saw nothing but blackest eyes, that void now lived inside her. As the paramedics checked her pulse, the camera lingered on the way her fingers clutched the blanket. It was a rhythmic, desperate movement, mimicking the clandestine heat of a heartbeat that was trying to find its way back to a normal pace. But for Laurie, normal was a country she could never return to. The Loomis Vigil. Dr. Loomis stood on the sidewalk, his trench coat stained with the mud of the lawn and the soot of the night. He was a man who had finally been proven right, but there was no joy in his vindication. He looked at the sheriff, who was barking orders at deputies to check every basement and every attic. Loomis knew the futility of the search. To look for Michael with flashlights and dogs was like trying to catch a shadow with a net. The shape didn't live in a basement, he lived in the collective subconscious of Haddonfield. He was the boogeyman made manifest, a carnal reminder that evil doesn't need a motive, only an opportunity. "You're wasting your time, Sheriff," Loomis whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "He isn't hiding. He's just waiting for the light to fade again." The sheriff looked at Loomis with a mixture of pity and annoyance, but the ambiguity of his own gaze betrayed him. He kept glancing toward the dark hedges, his hand hovering near his holster. The town's authority was a paper shield against the primordial silent force that had walked through their front doors. The empty stage of Lambkin Lane. The camera shifts one last time to the Myers house. The yellow police tape fluttered in the morning breeze like a festive, ironic decoration. Inside, the house was a hollow shell, yet it felt teeming with a ghostly energy. We moved through the rooms we now know so well. In the kitchen, the sunlight hit the empty knife block, casting a long, jagged shadow across the linoleum. In the upstairs hallway, the air still felt heavy with the scent of old dust and spent adrenaline. The house wasn't just a location, it was a partner in the crime, a silent accomplice that had nurtured the shape for 15 years. There was a lingering, tempting sense of unfinished business in the way the camera lingered on the open doorway of Judith's old room. The bed was gone, the carpet was bare, but the sexual tension of that first night in 1963 remained as a permanent psychic stain. The house was waiting. It was a set that would never be struck, a stage that would always be ready for the lead actor to return for his next act. The eternal echo. As the day progressed, the people of Haddonfield began to perform the rituals of life, but the movements were stiff, like puppets on strings. They cleaned their porches, they walked their dogs, and they looked over their shoulders. The soap opera continued, but the dialogue was hollow. Every conversation about the weather or the high school football game was just a mask for the question they were all too afraid to ask: where is he? The final satisfying closure isn't found in a body in a morgue. It is found in the acceptance of the inevitable. The audience is left with a sense of completion, not because the monster is dead, but because the myth is born. The last image is not of a face, but of a landscape. We see a montage of Haddonfield's most ordinary places: the schoolyard, the hardware store, the quiet suburban streets. Over these images, the sound of the breathing returns, not as a jump scare, but as a steady, comforting, and terrifying ambient noise. It is the sound of the town's new heart. The screen fades to a deep, velvety black. The credits roll in a stark, clinical font. There is no music, only the sound of that heavy, rhythmic inhalation and exhalation. It is the final thank you to the listener, a reminder that as long as there is darkness and a mask to fill it, the story will never truly end. The shape is gone, but the fear is home.